welcome to Edison TV. In this session, we're going to be highlighting the work of Kazia, an Australian oncology biotech focusing on solid tumours. With me is their CEO, James Garner. James, lovely to have you with us.
Thank you, Vivian. It's great to be here.
Now, tell me a bit more about Kazia.
Well, Kazia is an oncology biotech company. We're based in Sydney, but we actually work all over the world. The bulk of our clinical trial activity is in the United States. We have activity in Europe and in Asia as well. We're focused on the development of new cancer therapies, so with a focus primarily on solid tumors. But we work broadly across different types of cancer, different kinds of mechanism, and we work in a novel kind of partnership with larger companies. We bring a very different kind of business model to the work we do.
It is a very interesting business model. Tell me a bit more about it.
Well, most startup biotechs are based around a single particular piece of technology. Sometimes it's something they've developed themselves in-house. Sometimes it's something they've brought in from a university. But they end up being, to some extent, an all or nothing bet on a particular way of doing things. In Kazia, we've tried to take a different approach. We look for drugs that currently sit in other companies, which we think are very exciting, but which aren't strategic for the companies that are currently working on them. And in fact, there are many such drugs. Most big pharma companies produce many, many more drug candidates than they have the resources and the bandwidth, just the inclination to take forward. So we try to step in and partner with them for the promising candidates that don't fit their strategy. We have two drugs in our pipeline right now, and they both fit this mold. So our lead program, Paxalovid, was licensed out of Genentech a couple of years ago, and very promising drug, but Genentech just made a decision they weren't going to focus on brain cancer. And so we were able to bring that drug into our company. We've now taken it forward. It's in a pivotal study for registration. Our second drug, EVT-801, was originally discovered by Sanofi. It's been developed by a company called Evotec, a leading European company in drug development. But they won't take drugs into clinical development themselves. And so again, it's an opportunity for us to step in and partner with them. So we've really, we've been living this business model. We've got two great drug candidates in the pipeline, and they really reflect a rather different approach to this kind of work.
That's really interesting because, as you say, there are lots of companies that have things that are in their cupboards, basically, which they just have never developed simply because they've fallen out of favor or they've decided to go in a different direction. But actually, they've probably done a lot of work and spent a lot of money on drugs. So it's very smart.
That's absolutely right. And this is something that's familiar in many other industries. I mean, for example, in the mining sector, there's a lively secondary market in resource opportunities, in mines, in leases, and so on. Companies will just decide they're getting into lithium or they're getting out of copper. In the motion picture industry, a movie might change hands several times before it's actually released by a particular studio. But this is relatively new to pharmaceuticals. We're not the first to do it, however. There are companies that have built very successful businesses in this way. Companies like Tesaro, Clovis Oncology, that have built multi-billion-dollar businesses in some cases out of in-licensed assets. So we're hoping to follow that example and take a leaf out of their book.
So how would you describe your positioning relative to the broader biotech industry?
Well, the business model is deliberate, but in some ways the shape of our portfolio has been somewhat more serendipitous. And I think it's fair to say what is starting to emerge for Kazia is a focus on well-validated, but perhaps slightly unfashionable drug targets. So our lead program, Paxalovid, is a PI3K inhibitor. And there are 5 PI3K inhibitors already approved by FDA. So this is very, very well understood, very well validated, very well proven. The unique feature about Paxalovid is that it's the only drug in this class, for practical purposes, that can cross the blood-brain barrier. It's the only drug that can get into the brain. It's the only drug in this class that's got any chance of being a brain cancer drug. So it really brings this sort of mix of a very, very well understood space, but a unique differentiating feature. EVT-801, our new drug, is an angiogenesis drug. This is a $10 billion plus category. You know, 800-pound gorilla here is Avastin. But our drug brings something new. It targets a very, very specific part of angiogenesis, a target called VEGFR3. And this probably gives it some advantages versus other drugs in the class. So we've started to build a pattern of looking for these very, very well understood, very well proven targets, but bringing something new, something unique, something differentiating to it. And I think we're very happy with how that started to emerge.
Paxlovid, you were saying, is a drug that gets across the blood-brain barrier, and you're looking at glioblastoma, which is a graveyard in which many, many drugs are founded. I mean, glioblastoma, you know, the most aggressive, the most, you know, its tentacles go throughout the brain. It's full of all sorts of different cells. It's really a very, very difficult cancer to treat. Are you not worried that you might be following into that same sort of sea of despair that others have done?
It's certainly as tough an indication as one would ever find in drug development. This is it's one of the most aggressive cancers in modern medicine. No real risk factors. We tend to diagnose it quite late when the tumor is well established. Terrible prognosis, 12 to 15 months survival from diagnosis. And that really hasn't improved for the last 20 years. And the only FDA-approved drug for newly diagnosed patients doesn't work for 2/3 of patients. So, as you say, it's about as bad as it gets. And people have tried and failed. But we think we understand why that has been the case. One of the big challenges here is getting the drug into the brain. This is crucial. Most of the drugs we've tried in the past are not really designed to be brain cancer drugs. And crucially, they don't get into the brain. They're not very brain penetrant, as we often say. Now, Paxlovid is different. It's been developed from the beginning as a brain cancer drug. It was designed to treat this disease. It's beautifully brain penetrant. It gets into the brain very well. The PI3K target, the thing that this drug hits, is switched on in about 85 to 90% of patients with glioblastoma. So it's a very, very ubiquitous target for this group of patients. And we're using the drug in a slightly different way. We're using it where we've usually gone in this disease is we've targeted very, very late stage patients where the disease is very advanced. These are very, very sick patients. That's a tough group of patients to treat in this disease. And in all honesty, we're really not much short of a miracle is going to reverse the course of the disease at that stage. What we're doing, however, is targeting primarily the newly diagnosed patients. So patients who have just been diagnosed, they've had surgery and radiotherapy as part of their initial treatment. And at that stage, patients are much fitter. In many cases, they're still going about their daily lives. And we think if we can keep them there, even for just a few months longer, that's a very meaningful benefit. So I think the combination of the drug itself bringing something new to the game, but also the way that we're developing it being quite innovative, I think these things give us confidence that we're going to make a difference. And then the final thing I'd say here is I'm old enough to remember when people used to say the same thing about melanoma. 10 years ago, metastatic melanoma was a death sentence. Nothing worked. Medicine had nothing to offer, and it was seen as a no-hope indication. The last decade has seen that absolutely transform. Nobody would say that now of melanoma, and we have a saying in Kazia: everything is impossible until somebody does it. And so we hope that we'll be the ones that can maybe start to change the game for patients with glioblastoma.
Now, funny enough, as you're beginning this new adventure with glioblastoma, there are a lot of other indications now coming up in some of these, really advanced technologies, stem cell therapies, gene therapies, and of course the big one, immunotherapy, which is the real gorilla here, with so much focus in a very crowded marketplace. Are you worried that actually some of those approaches may suddenly steal your thunder?
Well, we we see immunotherapy as one tool in the toolkit, but I think the possibility for this to sort of supplant all other methods of treating cancer, we think is unlikely. Again, I remember when biologics were really starting to hit the mainstream in the early 2000s. We were seeing drugs like initially Rituxan and then Avastin, Herceptin, these huge products that. And for a while, people said there will be no more small molecule cancer drugs. Everything's going to be a biologic. We're going to treat cancer with monoclonal antibodies. That's going to be it. And that hasn't happened. Biologics remain about 40% of the oncology drug development landscape. And that figure has been constant for about the last decade or so. So we think there's room in the toolkit for a lot of different kinds of tools. And it's never going to be a one-size-fits-all approach to treating cancer. Now, immunotherapy, for example, in glioblastoma has not been a success. There have been large-scale studies, particularly, for example, the checkmate studies with nivolumab, which really have not shown any benefit in this disease. And that surprises nobody because these drugs don't really get into the brain. They're big fat antibodies. They don't cross the blood-brain barrier. And the brain is a very immunologically privileged space. So this isn't really somewhere where these drugs are going to get traction. So there are plenty of places where these kinds of drugs so far have not really shown benefit. And so we think there's plenty of room for what we're doing. We haven't ourselves tried to build an immunotherapy story. Both of our drugs actually have potential combination use with immunotherapy, which we will be starting to explore. But we haven't hung our hat on that because, as you say, it's a very, very crowded space. And we really think it's important that our drug candidates are not seen as sort of just trying to sort of succeed on the coattails of immunotherapy, but really have a therapeutic potential in their own right.
Let's turn now to EVT 801. What are your hopes for EVT 801?
This has been really exciting, actually. We said all along that it was going to be difficult to find a second drug candidate, a difficult second album, if you will, that was exciting as paxilosib, and we found it at last in EVT 801. The drug sort of fits the mold in a way in that it's an angiogenesis inhibitor fundamentally. And again, this is a very, very well-proven, well-understood mechanism of treating cancer. We've got drugs like Avastin, Sutent, Nexavar.
So basically what it does is it prevents the development of the blood supply that a cancer or solid tumor needs to grow.
Exactly. That's exactly right. And this is of course well proven science. There are two differences to EVT 801 though. Again, two unique differentiating things that it brings to this. The first is that it actually targets primarily lymphangiogenesis. And whereas angiogenesis is the formation of new blood vessels, lymphangiogenesis describes the formation of new lymphatic vessels, which is sort of this parallel circulation we all have in our body. And that has many of the same benefits as targeting angiogenesis. It basically starves the tumor. It cuts off the supply of nutrients to the tumor. But it does have one big difference, and that is that it produces much less hypoxia in the tumor. Drugs like Avastin cut off the oxygen supply to the tumor. That might sound like a good thing, and initially it is, but that hypoxia triggers adaptive resistance mechanisms in the tumor. So almost all tumors will eventually become resistant to drugs like Avastin. By targeting lymphangiogenesis, EVT 801 should substantially avoid that problem. Now, the second unique thing about the drug is that some of the drugs out there have been very, very diverse. They target angiogenesis, but they hit a whole load of other things as well. And that causes a lot of toxicity. The more targets you hit in a cell, the more chance there is of getting unexpected and toxic side effects. And so our drug is very, very precise. It particularly hits a target called VEGFR3, vascular endothelial growth factor receptor 3. But it really doesn't hit anything else. And that should make it much safer, much more tolerable than some of the older drugs in the class. And that should allow for much longer use, much better combination use, and so on. So again, we think we bring something different to the field. These effects are demonstrable in the lab. We've now got to see this in the human setting.
So what are your plans now for the drug?
Well, we plan to take the drug into a phase 1 human trial by the end of this calendar year, so by the end of calendar 2021. And that that still gives us quite some months ahead, but obviously getting a drug into the clinic is always an enormous threshold to cross. So there's a lot of work going on right now to make that a reality. We're likely to start that work initially in Europe, and partly that's just because we've got some great clinicians and some great sites who are incredibly engaged in the drug. But it's also partly because we want to make this phase 1 study very, very cutting edge in its design. We're going to do some very sophisticated biomarker work to really give us an understanding at a very early stage of exactly how our drug works, where it works, the ways we can track its effect. So this is going to be a very translationally rich study. It's going to give us a lot of information about the drug. And so we're sort of co-locating the study with some of the laboratories that can perform this work. And I think it's going to be an incredibly exciting project, actually. And as I say, starting up by the end of this year.
Are you worried that there may be some impact still from COVID?
We're watching this day by day, and of course it's a situation that evolves pretty rapidly. The bulk of our existing work is all US based. So in fact, the entire Paxlovid program right now is taking place in the United States. We did see some impact at a few centers there in the early days of the pandemic. So around about sort of April, May, June 2020, there's no doubt some of the hospitals we work in were affected for a few months at a time. But that really seems to have all washed out now. I think all of the centers we're working with are recruiting at full speed. They're operationally business as normal. And our pivotal study, GBM Agile for Paxlovid, is really just going gangbusters. It's recruiting at a terrific rate. So we haven't seen that there. Europe is a little bit more new territory. I think we're going to keep a very close eye on this. But fundamentally, I think that the reality here is that patients with cancer still need treatment no matter what. I think if we were doing a study in restless leg syndrome, for example, there would be an argument to say, look, those patients can come back in 6 months when things are quieter. But when we're talking about patients with advanced terminal cancer, patients can't just go home and wait. They have to be treated. And in many cases, participation in clinical trials is an integral part of how these patients are treated. So I think at our end of the industry, we've probably seen much less impact than some other kinds of therapeutic area.
So finally, what should investors be looking out for over the next 6 to 12 months to monitor progress?
I think there's 3 things in Kazia's sort of near to midterm future, and the first of those is data. It's always the lifeblood of every biotech company. We have right now 8 clinical trials ongoing with Paxlovid at various stages of activity, some starting up, some winding down. Obviously, the EVT-801 study starting up by the end of this year. But with that many clinical trials ongoing, there's always going to be a lot of data coming out. And now, fundamentally, we already have a high degree of confidence that the drug is active, but the data is going to help us to learn more, to open up new use cases for the drug, to identify new ways to benefit patients. So that's always something that's meaningful for patients, and we're expecting quite a number of data readouts over the second half of the year in particular. The second thing is the transition of EVT-801 into the clinic. It sounds like a sort of a small step for mankind in a way, but it's a really, really important transition point in the life of a drug when it moves from the lab into human trials. It's one of the biggest things that happens in the journey from the bench to the bedside. And we'll be making that transition for EVT-801 this year. It will at that stage become a clinical asset, and that really has all kinds of implications for how we're viewed as a company, for how the drug is viewed as a partnering opportunity, and so on. So that's going to be an important threshold for us. We will at that stage have 2 genuine clinical stage top quality assets in development. And then finally, we've had a number of cases. We've had a number of partnering transactions in the last few months, both outbound and inbound, and that remains a core part of our strategy. Just as I said, we look to bring drugs in lieu of our own in-house discovery. We look to partner them out for commercialization. We don't really aspire to be a commercial pharmaceutical company. For example, in the last couple of months, we signed a deal with Simcere Pharmaceutical in China to commercialize Paxlovid in that territory for brain cancer. Now, we're thinking and discussing and talking about other opportunities, other partners for Paxlovid in particular. Now, those discussions can sometimes take years. They sometimes happen very quickly, but I think that's the X factor, if you like, in Paxlovid's medium-term future is sort of how are we going to bring this drug to market? I think increasingly with Paxlovid, the question is no longer does the drug work, it's how are we going to commercialize it? And we expect to have a lot more to say about that as the year progresses.
It sounds to me that this year ahead is going to be absolutely terrific one for you.
Thank you very much. It's been a really exciting journey so far. We've been just absolutely thrilled with how the company is coming together and how both these drug candidates are moving forward. But as you say, I think the most exciting part of the trip lies ahead.
Thank you so much for talking to us.
Thank you.